On the way to the church, I could hardly concentrate on anything around me. It was as if the world was in slow motion, every detail gaining a surreal intensity. My sweaty, trembling hands gripped my phone tightly as I stared at the screen, rereading old headlines about James. The images and texts raced through my mind like flashes of a nightmare from which I couldn't escape. As soon as I entered the main hall, my eyes fell upon the altar, decorated with white flowers and aromatic candles, creating a serene and even spiritual atmosphere. James was there, next to the pastor, chatting with a light smile, as if nothing disturbed him. Seeing him so calm and assured made me even more nervous. He had that good guy demeanor that fooled anyone, including my mother. For a moment, a part of me wanted to doubt what I had discovered. Could it really be possible? Perhaps it was a mistake, an unfortunate coincidence. My mother was in a private room, finishing her preparations with the help of the bridesmaids. She had never looked so happy and radiant as she did that day. Her smile shone, and her eyes were full of joyful tears. She hugged me tightly, and for a second, I considered giving everything up and pretending that everything was fine. But that persistent voice kept whispering in my head, "You know the truth. He is not who he seems." "Dear, are you okay?" my mother asked, with a concerned expression. "You are so quiet." "Yes, Mom. I'm just emotional for you," I lied, feeling the knot in my throat tighten. I wanted her to see the sincere love in my eyes, but I also knew that if I did, I might crumble and tell everything before the right moment. As I stepped away from her, I felt a slight dizziness and needed to take a deep breath. I looked around, searching for an exit. I knew that once the ceremony started, my last chance to warn her before everything fell apart would be lost. I sat at the back of the church, hidden behind the guests, watching as people chatted animatedly and awaited the start of the ceremony. A few minutes later, the sound of music began to fill the hall, and everyone turned to look at my mother, who was now slowly and emotionally walking down the aisle. My heart raced with every step she took, and my stomach twisted in a way that left me almost breathless. My mind was torn between the love and gratitude I felt for her and the urgency to protect her. Every detail of that ceremony seemed ironically perfect. The guests smiled, the flowers decorated the venue with an indescribable softness, and I saw the happiness in the eyes of everyone who was there to celebrate the union. But, to me, it all felt like a scene from a horror movie. James didn't deserve to be there. He didn't deserve to say I do to my mother and share a life with her. When she reached the altar, my mother exchanged a loving glance with James. He held her hand, and they looked at each other with an intensity that, to anyone else, seemed genuine. But I saw something more. I saw the cold, calculating interest behind those eyes. He wasn't there for love, I knew that. And I was afraid of what he would be capable of if unmasked. With one last sigh, I decided it was time. If I waited any longer, that deceitful man would emerge victorious, winning my mother and possibly her assets. I gathered my courage, and the moment the pastor began to speak, I stood up and, with a firm voice, drew everyone's attention. "Mom, I need to talk to you right now," I said, sensing the guests' gazes turning towards me. My mother looked confused and bewildered, but she gestured for me to come closer. I walked down the aisle under curious and even irritated gazes. When I stopped beside her, I could see James's icy glare directed at me. He knew I had something important to say. "I can't let this happen, Mom," my voice came out trembling but determined. "There's something about James that you need to know before continuing." The silence that followed felt almost unbearable. My mother looked at me, torn between nervousness and concern. And in that moment, I knew that, despite everything, she trusted me. With trembling hands, I took my phone and showed her the evidence I had found. She took the device and began to read, her eyes widening as she absorbed the truth behind the man who was about to become her husband. James began to move as if he wanted to intervene, but my mother interrupted him, raising a hand and giving him a furious look. In that moment, she was not just the passionate woman at the altar, she was my mother, determined and protective. In a calm and firm tone, she said, "James, I'm calling the police right now. Don't move a muscle." James, in turn, looked around and took a step back, his face now devoid of the false smile from before. He knew he was cornered. Time seemed to freeze. The tension hung in the air like a dense, heavy, suffocating cloud. I could feel everyone's eyes on me and on James, who now wore a closed expression, almost impenetrable. Whispers began to spread through the hall, and my mother looked at him with an expression of disappointment and pain that I had never seen before. "James, is what my daughter is saying true?" she asked, her voice low but filled with a threatening calm. She was still holding the phone with the evidence, which included screenshots of suspicious conversations, records of hidden payments, and even an article about his ties to a dark spiritual group that promoted financial rituals and manipulations. James took a deep breath, and then, as if regaining his air of superiority, assumed a fake indignation expression. "Darling, you can't believe this. He began, his voice coated with sweetness and surprise. Your daughter is trying to sabotage our moment. It's obvious this is a manipulation. She must have found false or distorted information. You know me, you know I'd never do something like this. But my mother didn't seem convinced. She looked at him with a mix of pain and anger, not breaking eye contact. I felt a growing admiration for her in that moment, for not letting his words dissuade her from the truth. James, she interrupted, firmly, my daughter wouldn't do this without reason. And this evidence here, are you going to tell me it's fabricated? James swallowed hard, and for a moment his facade cracked. I could see a flash of anger and desperation in his eyes before he regained his calm demeanor. He shook his head and tried to maintain control. This is ridiculous. These accusations are unfounded, and you know I am an upright man. It's just, this girl, he shot a disdainful look at me, is jealous of our relationship. She doesn't want you to be happy because that means losing you to someone who can finally give you the life you deserve. My mother looked at me with tear-filled eyes but without hesitation. She knew that despite everything, I was there because I cared about her. It was a moment when our mother-daughter bond felt stronger than ever. James, I trusted you, I trusted every word, every promise, she whispered, her voice laden with deep sadness, and now I see that my daughter was right to be suspicious. The guests watched the unfolding scene with shock on their faces, some whispering among themselves. And then, without hesitating any longer, my mother took her phone and dialed the police number, stating in a firm voice, I'm reporting you, James. I don't know what your plan is, but I won't allow you to continue. James's expression changed drastically. He knew there was no room left for lies, and his face took on a sinister expression. Suddenly, he took a step toward me, his gaze cold and filled with a silent threat. I felt fear grow in my chest, but I maintained my firm posture. You just ruined something big for your mother, girl, he murmured, almost inaudibly. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Before he could take another step, two guests, close friends of my mother and respected figures in the community, intervened, positioning themselves between him and me. James looked around, realizing he was surrounded and had no way out. He tried to maintain dignity, but couldn't hide his nervousness. As we waited for the police to arrive, the atmosphere in the hall changed completely. What should have been a celebration now felt like a confrontation charged with tension. The guests looked visibly uncomfortable, and some approached to offer support to my mother, who was still fighting back tears. Finally, the sound of sirens broke the silence, and the police officers entered the hall. My mother handed over her phone with the evidence and explained the situation. James tried to argue, saying it was all a misunderstanding, but his voice was now weak, lacking the firmness it had before. Mr. James Thompson, said the officer with a serious tone, you are being detained on suspicion of fraud in connection with illegal activities. Any other statement can be used against you. As they let him out, he looked back and threw one last glare in my direction, a look that mixed anger with a promise of revenge. But I felt no fear, only a deep sense of relief. I knew I had done the right thing, no matter how hard it had been. My mother, still stunned, hugged me, and I felt her tears wet my shoulder. She whispered a thank you, squeezing me tightly. Relief and pain were evident in her voice. It had been a difficult day, but she finally knew the truth. The pastor, still in shock, suggested that the guests leave, and gradually the hall began to empty. Only a few close friends and family remained, staying to support us. I looked at my mother, and even amidst the sadness, I saw a light of determination in her eyes. We will get through this, daughter, she said, wiping her tears. You saved me from a dark fate. Thank you for being my daughter and my guardian. And so, at the end of a day that should have been marked by celebration, we discovered a new form of unity. We were stronger and closer than ever, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Hours later, the hall was already empty. The guests had left, some still in shock, others promising to return to offer support in the following days. It was just me, my mother, and a few close friends who had stayed to support us. The beauty of the flowers, now useless, and the absolute silence of the hall reinforced the sadness and melancholy that hung in the air. My mother was sitting on a bench, her eyes fixed on a distant point, as if she were still trying to comprehend everything that had just happened. I sat beside her in silence, not quite knowing what to say. She had gone through something devastating. I could see in her eyes the pain of someone whose trust had been shattered. Mom, I'm so sorry for doing this on your day, I murmured, my voice choked. Part of me still felt guilty for ruining what should have been one of the happiest moments of her life, but I knew there was no other option. She held my hand, squeezing it with a lightness that conveyed fragility and strength at the same time. No, daughter, you did what needed to be done. You saved me from something terrible, she replied, not taking her eyes off the void. Her voice trembled slightly, but there was gratitude and even pride in her words. A heavy silence settled between us until she continued, her voice fragile but sincere. I always wanted to believe that love could change everything, that it could erase the past. James seemed to be everything I dreamed of, she said, taking a deep breath. And I blinded myself to what was in front of me. Maybe out of fear of being alone, maybe out of wanting this happiness so much, she closed her eyes and a solitary tear rolled down her face. But you protected me, as you always have. The emotion of hearing her say that was overwhelming. Knowing that I had done the right thing, despite everything, brought me a sense of relief that mingled with the weight of what we had lost. It wasn't just an engagement that was breaking there, but a promise of a new life that, for a moment, she had truly believed in. Suddenly, one of my mother's close friends approached, bringing a glass of water. He looked at us with understanding and placed his hand on her shoulder, saying, "You did the right thing." This man would have brought nothing but pain. I saw his expression as he was taken away. A man like that never knows what true love is. Those words seemed to comfort my mother in a way I didn't expect. She took a deep breath, as if trying to absorb the strength that everyone around her offered. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be easy to erase the scars that James had left, especially now that his anger and threat were a shadow looming over us. "He said I ruined something great for you, Mom," I whispered, recalling James's last look. As if he had a plan and somehow I had destroyed everything. My mother looked at me, her eyes narrowing as she reflected on what I had just said. Up until that moment, she had been focused on James's betrayal and dishonesty. But now it seemed like she was realizing that there might be another dimension to all of this, something more sinister. What did he intend, after all? She murmured, almost to herself. Why would someone go so far to deceive in this way? It wasn't just for money, there's something more. She was right. James's involvement with the spiritual group, something that initially seemed like a bizarre story, now seemed to gain unexpected importance. I wondered how far his obsession extended, what he aimed to achieve with this union. Deep in my heart, I knew we were still not safe. James had made it clear that he wasn't the kind of person who let things go so easily. His anger and that look filled with dark intentions still echoed in my mind, a reminder that he might try something more. "Mom, I think that it would be good for us to take some precautions," I said, trying to sound calm. "I don't know how far he can go with this, but he seemed furious. Maybe we should talk to the police again, explain about the threats." My mother nodded, and I could see the determined sparkle slowly returning to her gaze. "You are right, daughter. Let's talk to the authorities. And if necessary, we will go to the end to ensure he doesn't come any closer to us." I rested my head on her shoulder, feeling the weight of the day finally lift. I knew our lives had changed forever, that the shadow of betrayal would still follow us for some time. But in that moment, I also felt that our bond had grown stronger. As we left the hall, the sky began to darken. On the horizon, the clouds threatened a storm. It was a portent, perhaps, that the battle with James was far from over. He was not the type of man who accepted defeat easily, and we would still need all the strength and courage to face what would come next. In the days that followed the interrupted wedding, my mother and I tried to return to a routine, although that was nearly impossible. What should have been a new phase of happiness for her had turned into a series of nightmares, filled with uncertainties. James was now out of reach, or so we thought. After a night in the police station, he paid an exorbitant bail and was released. I hoped that, with his reputation ruined, he would give up and disappear from our lives, but a part of me knew he wasn't the kind of man who left something like that unanswered. I myself began to notice changes in my own behavior. The simplest things, like going to college or even going to the supermarket, were accompanied by a constant feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore that fear, but it seemed to follow me wherever I went. My mother was equally worried. Her phone received anonymous calls at all hours of the day and night, always followed by a chilling silence. One afternoon, as I was coming home, I noticed a black car parked across the street. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, but as I got closer, I realized the windows were too dark and the driver was watching me intently. My heart began to race, and I felt a wave of panic rise to my throat. I quickened my pace and went inside, locking the door behind me. My mother was in the kitchen, preparing tea. She looked at me with concern. "Are you okay, dear?" she asked, her tone revealing that she shared the same anxiety. "I think we're being followed, Mom," I said, trying to stay calm. "There's a black car across the street. I'm almost certain it's someone sent by James." She turned pale, and I could see determination settle on her face as she put the teacup aside. "Then it's time to take action, daughter. We can't live in fear." We decided we would go to the station once more, this time requesting a restraining order against James and anyone associated with him. The authorities assured us they would be vigilant, but the hesitant tone of the officer who attended to us didn't give me much reassurance. That night, I was home alone while my mother visited a friend. The silence of the house felt even more oppressive than usual. I tried to distract myself with a book, but with every creak and noise I heard, my attention diverted, my body on alert. Suddenly, a piercing sound echoed through the room. My phone was vibrating insistently. I looked at the screen and saw a private number. A cold sensation ran down my spine. I answered, my heart racing. "Hello?" I asked, my voice a bit shaky. On the other end, only a disturbing silence. I was about to hang up when I heard a low, cruel laugh that I immediately recognized. "Did you think you had one, didn't you?" James's voice sounded cold and calculating. "But I'm not a man who accepts losing so easily, dear. Tell your mother that this is far from over." I felt my stomach churn and hung up the phone immediately, panic growing inside me. My hands trembled so much that I almost dropped the phone. My mind raced with thoughts about what he might be planning. I knew he was dangerous, but hearing his voice and realizing how far he was willing to go left me in a state of absolute terror. My mother arrived a few minutes later, finding me sitting on the couch, still in shock. I told her about the call, about the warning James had left, and I could see the anger boiling in her eyes. She ran her hand through her hair, trying to organize her thoughts. "We're getting out of here for a few days," she said, determined. "I have a house in the countryside that your father left me. It's not luxurious, but it's safe and secluded." I immediately agreed, and in less than an hour, we had packed the essentials and were on the road. The journey was long and dark, but with each passing kilometer, I felt the weight of James's threat drifting further away. My mother drove in silence, focused, but her serious expression showed that she was also ready to face whatever was necessary to protect our peace. We arrived at the country house late at night, and the place had a calm and cozy atmosphere, a refuge amid the storm. The night seemed peaceful, and the wind whispered softly through the trees around us. I locked the door and looked outside one last time before turning off the lights. A sigh of relief escaped my lips. We were finally out of his reach. But despite being isolated, fear lingered. The threat James represented loomed over us like an invisible shadow. He knew our habits, our vulnerabilities. He knew exactly where to hit us to destabilize us. The only certainty I had was that we needed to be prepared for anything. Our lives would never be the same, but we were determined to protect each other, no matter the cost. The peace we were trying to rebuild would be preserved, and I wouldn't rest until I ensured that James would never have power over our lives again. The days in the country house brought a certain relief, but an unsettling calm also took hold of us. Even though we were isolated, my mother and I couldn't shake the feeling that James was nearby, like an invisible presence lurking. The temporary safety of distance, however, began to crumble when we noticed signs that he was indeed willing to go further to keep us under his control. On the first night, while we were organizing our belongings and trying to adapt to the new environment, we heard noises outside, as if something, or someone, was prowling around the house. I looked at my mother, who wore a tense expression, and she signaled for me to be quiet. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the outside through the window. Nothing. Just emptiness and the sound of branches lightly brushing against the wind. But on the second night, we were awakened by an even louder noise, like something being thrown against the wall of the house. I ran to the living room, followed by my mother, and together we looked out the kitchen window. On one of the outside walls, red paint was dripping like blood, creating a strange and threatening symbol. He was telling us he knew where we were. My mother grabbed her phone and called the local police, asking them to send a squad car. But being in a rural and remote area, the response was slower than we had hoped. As we waited, fear mixed with anger, but I knew we couldn't wait. We needed to take action. We knew James was trying to intimidate us, but we also understood that this would only end when we confronted this threat once and for all. The next morning, we decided to take some extra security measures in the house. We installed reinforced locks on the doors and windows and kept the phones charged at all times. Additionally, my mother suggested that we seek help from an old friend of hers who lived in the area. He was a former police officer and someone we trusted to help us with security. Called Ben, he arrived that afternoon, analyzing every corner of the property with an experienced eye. Ben was a sturdy man, with a calm presence, but with an attentive and observant way that immediately gave me a sense of security. After hearing the whole story, he agreed to help us and even offered to spend a few nights at the house to ensure we would be safe. People like him thrive on psychological power, he explained. The idea is to intimidate until you lose control. If we respond firmly, he will realize that you are well prepared. This usually drives off types like him. His words calmed me a bit, but I knew James was no ordinary person. He was manipulative and cruel, and his connection to that spiritual group with dark interests made him believe he had a higher purpose, as if he were above anyone else. Ben set up a series of improvised security cameras around the house and instructed us on how to act if we heard any noise or suspected something. His presence did indeed bring a bit of peace that night, and for the first time in days, my mother and I managed to rest a little. However, in the early morning, I was awakened by a sudden noise coming from outside. I got up and, as I passed through the hallway, I found Ben standing, holding a flashlight and gesturing for me to stay quiet. He handed me a small knife and whispered softly, "Lock yourself in the room with your mother and don't come out unless I say it's safe." I felt my heart race, but I did what he said. I ran to the room and locked the door, trying to control my breathing while listening to what was happening outside. My mother was sitting on the bed, her face pale with worry. I held her hand, and we waited in absolute silence. We heard footsteps outside the house, then the sound of breaking branches and what seemed to be a distant murmur. Ben appeared to be patrolling around the house in total vigilance, while the footsteps outside continued. At one point, the sound ceased. We remained still, anxious, until finally, Ben returned to tell us that it was all clear. "Was it him?" I asked, trying to disguise my fear. Ben nodded, his expression serious. "Apparently, yes. But I think he's trying to figure out how prepared you are. Tomorrow we will go to the station again and speak with the city police chief. He needs to understand that this man represents a real and constant threat." I knew that facing James face to face, or even filing a more detailed report, was something necessary, but it also terrified me. James was the type of person who thrived on the fear he spread, and every step we took towards freedom seemed to draw him in even more. The next morning, my mother and I followed Ben to the police station. We presented the evidence we had gathered up to that point, the records of the calls, the threatening messages, and the symbol on the wall, in addition to Ben's reports of strange movements in the house at night. The police chief listened to us carefully, and after a long conversation, he finally agreed to place a patrol for periodic surveillance in the area. It wasn't the definitive solution, but at least it would give us an extra sense of security. So, we returned home, trying to find some peace. We knew the battle against James was far from over, but now, at least, we had allies and a support network. I just hoped it would be enough to keep him from reaching us, and to finally put an end to this persecution. In the days that followed, James seemed to always be a step ahead, as if every barrier we tried to create only increased his determination to reach us. The peace we hoped to find in the countryside house was rapidly fading, replaced by constant tension and the silent presence of an invisible enemy. Ben, true to his promise, remained vigilant, sleeping few hours and observing every detail of the perimeter around the house. He set up an improvised security system with small cameras connected to a laptop and positioned sound alerts on the windows. My mother and I began to divide our time between preparing the house and gathering additional information about James and his connections. One afternoon, while Ben and I discussed the next steps, he watched me with an attentive gaze. "He wants you around, you know?" Ben said, his voice low. "Men like James can't stand being challenged, and he seems more determined than ever. But I believe he has a weakness." I frowned, trying to understand what Ben meant. "Weakness? What weakness could he have?" "He always seems in control," I replied, feeling a mix of curiosity and concern. Ben nodded, as if reflecting on his own words. "Yes, he controls, but like all manipulators, he has something that controls him too. It's probably the fear of losing what he believes is his. This includes his image, his assets, his status. If we can hit him where it hurts the most, he might falter." Those words lingered in my mind, echoing as I thought about what he said. James always worried about maintaining a perfect image. Perhaps that was the key to putting him at a disadvantage, attacking his reputation and exposing his secrets. But how to do that without putting our lives at even greater risk? That night, Ben suggested we conduct an even deeper investigation into James's past and the group he was involved with. Using a secure laptop and private networks to avoid being tracked, he began searching for old articles and public records that could reveal something compromising. At one point, we found an article from 5 years ago reporting that James had been investigated for a fraudulent investment scheme. Apparently, he was part of a group that spiritually manipulated people's emotions and weaknesses, convincing them that they would gain prosperity and financial stability by donating their possessions. The victims were led to believe they needed to sacrifice part of their finances in exchange for peace and fortune. It was a sophisticated strategy that blended spiritual belief with psychological manipulation. My mother was shocked as she read the words. I could see the anger and disgust mingling in her eyes, as if she were reliving every moment she believed in James's promises. "He tried to do this to me, didn't he?" she murmured, her gaze lost. "He wanted me to put my name on his assets, to ensure his financial stability. It's possible he was planning something even worse," I replied, feeling the intensity of the moment. "He didn't just want your money. He wanted to control you. And when I got in the way, he realized his plan was threatened. We decided it was time to bring the police back into the case, this time with more substantial evidence. Ben suggested we prepare a dossier with all the information we had gathered, from threats and intimidation attempts to evidence of fraud. Our hope was that by presenting a solid case, we could pressure the authorities to keep a closer watch and, perhaps, secure a stricter restraining order against James. That night, before sleeping, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. We believed we were in control of the situation, but we knew he could counterattack at any moment. It didn't take long for us to realize how right we were. It was around 2 in the morning when the sound of an explosion woke us up. We ran to the living room and saw, through the window's reflection, that one of the security cameras had been destroyed. Ben was on the phone with the police while my mom and I sheltered ourselves behind the couch, waiting for the worst. Minutes later, the sound of fast, heavy footsteps approached the door. Ben stood up, holding a gun, and positioned himself near the entrance, ready to protect the house. I felt my heart racing, panic consuming me, but I knew Ben was there to help us. Suddenly, the sound of sirens echoed down the road. The police had arrived in time, and the footsteps outside stopped immediately. Peeking through the window, I saw the figure of a man running into the woods. The silhouette, although blurred by the darkness, was unmistakable. It was James. The police swept the area, but he had already disappeared into the night. The authorities assured us they would conduct frequent patrols and even suggested we leave the house temporarily, but my mom refused. She was tired of running, of living in fear. No more being the victims, she said with a firmness I had never seen before. This man tried to manipulate us, tried to take everything from us, but we won't let him win. Ben agreed and suggested increasing the security of the house. And even with the adrenaline still high, I knew that night had changed something in us. We felt fear, but now we were united in a purpose, to fight against James to the end. After that night of terror, something changed in us. The fear was still present, but it now mixed with a fierce determination to confront James, expose his true nature, and ensure that he could never threaten anyone again. My mom and I decided we would not be his defenseless victims. With Ben's help, we intensified our research into James's past and his links to the dark spiritual group. That morning, Ben managed to contact a former colleague who was a private investigator. With him, we uncovered an important detail. James was one of the leaders of a secret organization that combined spiritual manipulation with financial extortion. The group lured people in moments of vulnerability, promising riches and happiness in exchange for financial sacrifices. James, it seemed, had been involved with them for years, and his methods of manipulation were meticulously calculated. Ben showed us a list of potential victims, people who had lost everything by getting involved with James and his circle of influence. Each of these individuals had been convinced to donate their possessions in exchange for a financial rebirth that, obviously, never materialized. Some of them were willing to testify against James, but they were so afraid that they preferred to remain anonymous. My mom, looking at the list, recognized some of the names. They were known people who had disappeared from society after scandals of financial fraud. She was even more horrified to realize the network of destruction that James had left in his wake. Seeing the information about his influence and the havoc he had wreaked in so many people's lives, an idea began to form in my mind. What if we use his victims to expose him publicly? I suggested. He is obsessed with his image and control over it. If these people come together and tell the truth, he could be unmasked and, hopefully, even convicted. Ben and my mom exchanged glances, considering the proposal. It was risky, as we would involve victims who still carried trauma and fear of reprisals. But it was also a powerful opportunity to turn James's own obsession against him. However, before we could act, something unexpected happened. I received an envelope without a return address, left at the front door of the house. Upon opening it, I found a photo of my mother and me, taken while we were shopping at the local supermarket. Alongside the image was a note written in shaky letters: "You don't know who you're dealing with. Back off while you can." The shock left me paralyzed. He was watching us closely, monitoring our every move. I showed the note to Ben and my mother, and I saw the worry in her eyes. But instead of being intimidated, she simply lifted her chin and spoke with a determined voice. "This just proves we're on the right track. He is losing control." Ben agreed but warned us about the danger this represented. James was cornered, and men like him were more dangerous when they felt they were losing. We needed to act quickly and intelligently. That night, Ben suggested that my mother and I stay in a safe house while he conducted a deeper investigation into James's movements. Using security cameras and trackers, he discovered that James had settled in a house in the same town, just a few kilometers from where we were. This explained how he could monitor us so closely. Now we knew where he was, and that gave us an advantage. We decided it was time to take the next step, gather witnesses and build a solid case against him. Ben contacted some of the victims who were willing to collaborate. Cautiously, we organized a meeting in a small safe house, where we could discuss the details without fear of being overheard. The meeting was intense and emotional. The victims shared stories of betrayal and manipulation, some even with tears in their eyes as they recalled how much they had lost. It was clear that James used a meticulous pattern, convincing each person that their financial and emotional problems could only be resolved by following his spiritual path and investing in the organization. My mother, upon hearing these accounts, squeezed my hand tightly, as if with each story of pain she felt a little more disgust and outrage. We saw there the reflection of what could have happened to her had I not uncovered the truth in time. We decided to record the testimonies of the victims, with their permission, and prepare them as evidence. Ben took care of the security and ensured that no one, besides us, knew the location of that meeting. Each victim, upon finishing their testimony, seemed a little more relieved, as if they were finally breaking free from James's psychological hold. That night, we returned home exhausted but with a sense of hope. We had enough evidence to ensure that James would be investigated and exposed. The next step would be to file a formal complaint, based on the victims' statements and the fraud records we had already found. But before we could relax, another blow came. When we arrived, we found the house dark. Strange, since Ben had left the lights on to give us a sense of security. My heart began to race as we slowly moved down the dark hallway. Suddenly, a silhouette appeared in the doorway of the living room, and I felt the blood freeze in my veins. It was James, standing there with a cold, calculating smile. He had managed to get in. "Did you really think you could defeat me?" he murmured, his voice filled with hatred. "I gave everything to your mother, and this is how I'm repaid? Now you will feel the consequences of challenging me." My mother and I stood frozen, fear etched on our faces. Ben, who was right behind us, reacted quickly, shielding us while James stared at us with an expression that mixed anger and disturbing satisfaction. We knew that confrontation wouldn't end there. But for the first time, he was face to face with us, and the battle had become personal. The tension in the air was palpable. James was standing at the entrance of the room, staring at us with a look that mixed anger and contempt. Ben moved to position himself between us and James, his body rigid and his expression serious, making it clear that he was prepared to protect my mother and me at any cost. "I don't know how you got in here, but you better leave now," James, Ben said, his voice firm. "You no longer have control over them. We have exposed your lies, and it's just a matter of time before the police have enough to take you down." James let out a low laugh that echoed ominously around the room. "You are truly naive, thinking you can stand up to me," he replied, his eyes fixed on me. "I'm not an ordinary man, and the truth is, I gave her," he pointed at my mother, "something you'll never understand." My mother, who had remained silent until then, lifted her chin and replied, her voice strong and fearless, "What you gave was a theater of lies, James. You manipulated my emotions and tried to control me. And you almost succeeded." James took a few steps toward us, still smiling with that arrogant air, and his tone shifted from threatening to disturbingly calm. "You think that's all, Margaret? I was offering you a true life, a life away from suffering and mediocrity. But your daughter here, she destroyed everything. She doesn't want you to be happy." I felt my heart race at his words. That man, even when exposed, was still trying to manipulate my mother, now using me as the problem. But I knew she saw clearly who he was now. "My daughter is the only reason I opened my eyes in time, James. She saved me, something you would never do," my mother replied, her voice firm but pained. James's eyes shone with something that seemed like a mix of hatred and disgust, as if he was finally realizing he had lost control over her. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as if considering an exit, but then his face hardened again. "Do you two have any idea what you are about to face?" he murmured, more to himself than to us. "I have given too much to this life, to this organization, and I will not lose to you." Ben, alert to his movements, stepped forward, maintaining a safe distance but indicating that he was ready to act. I felt my mother grip my hand, a small gesture, but it gave me the courage I needed to speak. "James, it's over," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You've lost. The police already have enough evidence, and the people you deceived will testify against you. It's just a matter of time." For a moment, James's face changed. His expression of superiority vanished, replaced by a contained fury that seemed about to explode. He stepped even closer until Ben intercepted him. "I've heard enough," Ben said calmly. "Get out of here, James, before things get even worse for you." James hesitated, his gaze shifting between us, and then, with one last disdainful look, he stepped back. It seemed he was finally realizing the situation had slipped out of his control. But before leaving, he turned to my mother and murmured, almost like a veiled threat, "Remember, Margaret, I gave you something that no one else will. When all this is over, you will still think of me." He left the house, and the tension in the room finally seemed to dissipate. I looked at my mother, who was taking deep breaths, her eyes watery but resolute. Ben let out a sigh and placed his hand on my shoulder. "You were very brave," he said proudly. "He was trying to break you until the end. But now that you've shown that you're not afraid, he will think twice before trying anything again." My mother hugged me, and I felt the warmth and love in her gesture, a relief after everything we had been through. She looked at me with a faint but sincere smile. "If it weren't for you, daughter, I might have fallen into that trap forever. Thank you for bringing me back." I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. It had been a difficult journey, full of moments of doubt and fear, but now I knew it had been worth it. We were closer and more confident in our strength than ever. In the following days, Ben continued to monitor the area to ensure that James wouldn't try anything else. We officially filed a report, and the police began investigating the victims' statements. Gradually, more and more information about the organization started to emerge, revealing the extent of the manipulation and fraud that James and his accomplices had committed. The news spread quickly, and those involved began to be investigated by the authorities. James disappeared from town after the accusations, but the authorities promised to follow his trail until he was found. My mother and I finally felt a real peace. Over time, the feeling of being watched diminished, and each day seemed like a new chance for a fresh start. A few weeks passed since the confrontation with James, and little by little, my mother and I were trying to rebuild our lives. The local police maintained an ongoing investigation, and the file with the victims' testimonies was being analyzed to open a formal case against him and his accomplices in the organization. Ben continued to support us, both emotionally and in vigilance, ensuring there were no new threats. It seemed we were finally free from James's shadow. However, I couldn't shake a persistent feeling that everything was too calm. Some nights, as I walked silently through the house, I felt as if I were still being watched, an almost visceral instinct alerting me that something wasn't completely resolved. My mother also shared this feeling but preferred not to talk about it, perhaps trying to believe that all of that was behind us. One afternoon, while I was tidying up some things in the living room, I heard my mother calling my name from the kitchen, her voice anxious. I ran over and found her holding a letter in her hands, her eyes wide. "What is it, Mom?" I asked, fearing the answer. She showed me the letter, and my stomach churned as I read the words written in a familiar handwriting. It was from James. "Dear Margaret, I hope you are well. I know you must think I'm running away, but understand that this is far from over. I offered you a world beyond what anyone could comprehend, and your daughter, the one you consider so loyal, destroyed everything. But remember, Margaret, not everything is as it seems. I will be back soon, and we will still resolve this. With love, James." The letter hit like an unexpected blow, proof that he was still around, watching us and waiting for the right moment to strike. I looked at my mother, who was visibly shaken, but now determined not to be intimidated. "He's not going to take my peace away again, daughter. This time, we're going to put an end to this once and for all," she said, her voice firm. When Ben learned about the letter, he reinforced the security of the house and ensured that the police were aware of the threat. Even so, we knew that James was cunning and could be one step ahead, ready to strike when we were vulnerable. That night, my mother and I discussed our next actions. We agreed to continue collaborating with the police while gathering even more evidence that could incriminate him if he made any attempt to come near. We were tired of living in fear and determined to confront him head-on if necessary. The next morning, a sound of breaking glass woke us up. Ben, who was in the watchroom, ran outside with the flashlight, and through the reflection in the window, I saw the glint of a silhouette quickly passing through the yard. It was James. My heart raced, but I knew we couldn't just stand by and watch. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining the situation and asking them to send reinforcements immediately. The night was quiet, except for the sound of Ben's footsteps and the rustling of leaves as he looked for signs of James. Time seemed to stand still. Every second was a test of nerves as my mother and I waited for the police to arrive. The sense of danger was almost physical, and every noise around us made us flinch. Suddenly, we heard the back door open, and a chill swept over my body. Ben appeared shortly after, but his face was tense. He ran away again. But he won't hide forever. He's losing control, and that makes him more dangerous. It was then that my mother did something I never expected. She picked up her phone and started recording a video. "Margaret? What are you doing?" I asked, confused. She looked at me with a determined expression. "If James wants to watch us, then let's expose ourselves. I'm going to tell our story publicly and show everyone what he's capable of. No more hiding what we've been through because of him." In the video, she shared everything, from how she met James to the manipulations, the threats, and the last attempt at a break-in. Every word she said was filled with a raw, unfiltered truth that deeply moved me. She was facing her fear in a powerful way, turning what was once a secret into a full exposure, where no one could ignore who James was. When the video was published on social media, it quickly gained visibility. The reaction from people was immediate, with messages of support and outrage at the situation we were living in. The police, alerted by the fallout, intensified the search for James, and new witnesses came forward, people who had previously been afraid to report his involvement. In the following days, silence reigned once more. James, who had always thrived on fear and control, now found himself exposed, unable to hide in the shadows. The world knew the truth, and that was something he could not manipulate or erase. My mother, who had once been his victim, was now his greatest threat. The tension, however, had not yet ended. We knew James would not give up so easily and would likely try something desperate before being captured. But for the first time, I felt that we had a real chance to win. We were ready for whatever came next. My mother's video quickly spread across networks, attracting attention from local newspapers and even victims we had not yet met. She had faced her own fear, exposing the story and dismantling the image that James had built up for years. This act of courage restored her dignity but also ignited James's fury. I knew he wouldn't let this go without one last move. In the days that followed, Ben maintained constant vigilance around us, noticing even the slightest suspicious movement. The police were now keeping a close watch and trying to track James, who was on the run, yet still, an instinct in me told me he wasn't far away. Deep down, I knew he would make one last attempt to confront my mother and regain the control he had lost. And then, on a quiet night, the unexpected happened. While Ben was on a watch post around the house, the security alarm went off. My mother and I ran to the living room and found the door unlocked. By this point, the police had been notified and were on their way, but the fear was palpable. We knew James was nearby. Suddenly, we heard the sound of footsteps on the porch, and then, he entered. James appeared through the door with a furious and determined expression. The elegant and calculating man had given way to someone consumed by desperation. He looked directly at my mother, his presence exuding an almost suffocating threat. "Margaret," he began, his voice controlled but loaded with rage, "did you really think you could destroy me so easily? That the truth you told would bring me down?" My mother, though scared, stood firm, taking a deep breath before responding. "James, I'm not trying to destroy you. I just want the world to know who you really are. And I will not be silent anymore." With each of her words, it seemed that he grew even more furious. I could see in his eyes the wounded pride, the inability to accept that, this time, he no longer had power. "You destroyed everything," he shouted, taking a step toward us. "I could have given you a real life, but you chose mediocrity and ruin." Ben, who had returned in time, quickly positioned himself between him and us, his face displaying calm and control. "Enough, James, you lost. It's time to go," Ben said, his voice firm and unwavering. James, with his eyes blazing, took a step back, trying to process the defeat that surrounded him. And then, with a cold smile, he said something that sent chills down my spine. "This isn't over. I always come back, Margaret. Always." We heard the sound of sirens approaching, but before the police arrived, James turned and left through the back door, disappearing into the night. When the police entered, they searched the house and the surrounding area, but he had already vanished. Still, the damage was done, he knew he was cornered, and we had shown that he no longer had control over us. The next morning, the news of the confrontation reached the local press. Several victims finally felt safe enough to provide formal testimonies, creating a strong network of witnesses against James. Now, with the support of the community and the victims, my mother and I became active voices in the investigation, ensuring that he could no longer manipulate anyone. The weeks that followed were a mix of relief and caution. James was being sought, but we knew he might still be nearby, waiting for a chance to retaliate. However, our lives finally began to stabilize. For the first time in a long time, we managed to find moments of peace. My mother and I resumed our hobbies, reconnected with friends, and slowly rebuilt our daily routine. Ben, who had become a close friend and constant support, helped create a safety net around us, and we remained vigilant, but without allowing fear to control us. A few weeks later, we received a call from the detective in charge of the case. James had been found and arrested in a nearby town. He had tried to flee, but with the evidence gathered and the testimonies of the victims, his time of manipulation was over. He would be brought to trial, and everyone he had deceived would finally have justice. My mother, upon hearing the news, sighed in relief. I felt a weight lift from our shoulders, as if we were finally free from the shadow that had haunted us for so long. In the days that followed, the local community united in support of us and the victims of James, and the trial was an event that marked a new chapter in our lives. In the courtroom, I watched my mother testify against him with a firmness that only someone who had endured everything she had could possess. She told her story, faced her fears, and finally exposed the truth for all to hear. James, for his part, remained silent, his gaze empty, knowing that his empire of manipulation and fear was crumbling. At the end of the trial, James was sentenced to a long prison term, and we all felt that justice had been served. But the most important thing was that we had overcome that nightmare together, and we emerged from it stronger, more resilient, and more connected than ever. The day of James's trial came faster than we expected, and although we had prepared, we knew that reliving all the events during the trial would bring painful memories to the surface. My mother and I sat side by side, waiting for our turn to testify. Ben was also there, supporting us, as were some of the victims who had decided to share their stories of manipulation and loss. The courtroom was packed with faces of journalists and curious onlookers closely following the case. The exposure my mother had made by posting her account on social media was crucial in breaking the silence and revealing the extent of James's crimes. That courageous action had not only protected us but had also encouraged dozens of other people to speak out and seek justice. When James was brought into the courtroom, I felt a shiver of nerves. He looked different, the expression that once conveyed arrogance was now somber and tired. Yet, still, when our eyes met, I felt a pang of anger. Even knowing he was nearing the end, he still maintained a defiant posture, as if he still believed he could escape from it all. The judge began the session, and one by one, the victims started to tell their stories. Men and women recounted how James had used false promises of wealth and happiness, manipulating their vulnerabilities to take everything they had. It was hard to hear so many accounts, each one a reflection of the pain James had caused and the abyss he had tried to push us into. When it was our turn, my mother stood up to give her testimony. Her voice trembled at first, but she soon found the firm and sincere tone that characterized her. She recounted how she met James, the moments of emotional manipulation, and the slow process of losing control that he imposed on her. Each of her words carried a profound truth, and I saw admiration in the eyes of everyone around. "I am not a naive woman," she declared, looking directly at James. "But you used my pains and hopes against me. You made promises that seemed to be everything I wanted to hear, but deep down, they were just tools to imprison me." I felt my chest swell with pride as my mother spoke. She was confronting her traumas and, instead of succumbing to fear, was transforming her story into strength. I knew that this moment was more than justice, it was a liberation. When it was my turn, I explained how I had suspected James, how I sought the evidence that changed everything, and how we were able to stop him from moving forward with his plans together. Recalling the moments of tension and fear was difficult, but I felt that each word contributed to closing a chapter. I looked at James as I spoke, and I realized that, finally, he was beginning to show signs of defeat. At the end of the trial, the judge delivered the sentence. James was convicted of fraud, coercion, and psychological manipulation. He would try to appeal, of course, but the weight of the evidence and the testimonies against him was overwhelming. For the first time in a long time, we felt that justice had been served. As I left the courtroom, I felt the air lighter, as if a new phase was opening up for us. My mother and I embraced, and Ben, who had been by our side every step of the way, smiled with a proud look. "You were incredible," he said in a soft voice. "You not only faced James but also helped others to do the same." Back home, a new chapter began. That experience had deeply marked us, but it had also transformed us. My mother rediscovered strengths she had never imagined she possessed, and I felt that I had grown in an irreversible way. The pain and fear gave way to an unbreakable bond between us, something that nothing and no one could ever take away. In the following months, my mother began to help other women who had been victims of manipulation and psychological abuse, turning her experience into a support movement. I saw her rise again, determined to share what she learned to prevent others from going through what she went through. And, in the meantime, I also moved forward in my life with new purposes, feeling that all of this had strengthened me and made me more prepared for any challenge. On the days when the memory of James surfaced, I knew he no longer represented a threat. His power over us had vanished, replaced by a restored confidence and a security that only comes when you face and overcome your worst fears. Looking to the future, we knew we were ready to start anew, free to build a life in peace, with a bond that only grew stronger. That difficult journey, which had pushed us to our limits, was now just a memory, proof that together we could face anything.